Luna pushed open the heavy door to Studio 4, her tablet clutched in one hand and a latte balanced precariously in the other. Her heart thrummed with a mix of caffeine and anticipation. This pitch was the culmination of months of sleepless nights and meticulous planning. She needed every second in this space to get it right. But as she stepped inside, she froze. The room wasn't empty. Instead of the quiet, sterile rehearsal space she'd envisioned, the air was thick with the low hum of meditative music. A small group of people, seated cross-legged on yoga mats, was scattered across the floor. At the front of the room, a man stood with his back to her, his hands calmly resting at his sides. He was barefoot, dressed in loose, earth-toned clothing that looked like it was made for lounging on a mountaintop. His voice, low and steady, drifted through the room like a current. "Focus on your breath," he said, his tone warm and unhurried. "Let the noise of the world fade away. You're here now, in this moment." Luna blinked, confusion quickly morphing into irritation. She stepped further into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, a sound that felt jarring against the peaceful ambiance. The man turned, his calm expression faltering slightly as their eyes met. He was younger than she expected, with dark, thoughtful eyes and a slight smile that seemed permanently etched into his face. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice still calm, though there was a flicker of curiosity. "I think I'm supposed to be asking you that," Luna replied, raising an eyebrow. She set her latte and tablet on the nearest chair. "I booked this room for a rehearsal." His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't lose his composure. "That's strange. I've had it reserved for weeks for my mindfulness workshop." Luna exhaled sharply and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the confirmation email. "See? Studio 4, 10 a.m. "Same here," he said, pulling up his own reservation on his phone. "Looks like a double booking." The group on the mat started murmuring, glancing between the two. Luna's jaw tightened. "Well, I don't have time for this," she said flatly. "I need this space." "So do I," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Maybe we can work this out." Luna crossed her arms. "Work it out? Great, you tell your group to leave and problem solved." His lips twitched, almost as if he were amused. "That's not exactly what I had in mind." Luna's arms tightened across her chest, her gaze unwavering. "Look, I don't know what kind of yoga retreat you're running here, but this is a rehearsal studio, not a meditation cave. I have a pitch to perfect, and I'm not exactly swimming in free time." Asher's calm demeanor remained intact, though his brows knitted together slightly. "It's not a yoga retreat." He glanced at the group behind him, who were now watching the exchange with mild interest. "This is a mindfulness workshop, and I would argue that focus and clarity are just as important as whatever pitch you're working on." Luna scoffed, waving a hand toward the mats. "Focus and clarity don't require a rented studio. You could do this in a park or on a rooftop or literally anywhere else." "And you could rehearse in a coffee shop," Asher countered, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "But we both booked this space, and I don't see anyone leaving." Her jaw clenched, a sharp retort on the tip of her tongue, but she stopped herself. The truth was, she couldn't think of another venue. Her tiny apartment was too cramped, the office too chaotic, and the thought of rehearsing in public made her stomach churn. She sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I can't lose this time." "And neither can I," Asher replied, his tone soft but resolute. For the first time, his calmness didn't grate on her nerves. There was no arrogance in his voice, only conviction. "My clients rely on this space. It's important to them." Her shoulders sank slightly as the reality settled over her. "So, what? We just cram in here together and pretend we're not constantly in each other's way?" He tilted his head, considering. "We could take turns." Luna's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, sure. I'll just sit quietly in the corner while you tell everyone to breathe through the chaos. That won't be distracting at all." The faintest smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "It's breathe past the chaos, but yes, something like that." She stared at him, weighing her options or lack thereof, before letting out a reluctant, drawn-out sigh. "Fine, we'll try. But if you so much as hum during my presentation practice, I'm kicking you out." "Deal," he said, extending a hand. She hesitated before shaking it, his grip warm and steady against hers. A truce, for now. But as she returned to her chair, She couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be more complicated than either of them realized. The tension in Studio 4 was palpable, like two opposing forces battling for dominance in a confined space. On one side of the room, Luna paced back and forth, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she muttered the opening lines of her pitch. Her tablet rested on a chair, propped up like a silent judge, while she gestured toward an imaginary audience. Her voice, clipped and precise, cut through the air in sharp bursts. On the other side, Asher sat cross-legged on a yoga mat, exuding an infuriating calm that seemed entirely at odds with Luna's frenetic energy. A half-circle of participants mirrored his posture, their eyes closed as they followed his slow, deliberate guidance. His voice was a soothing murmur, a steady undercurrent to Luna's more aggressive cadence. "Notice the tension in your shoulders," Asher said softly. "Invite it to ease with each breath. Inhale and release." "Which is why our platform offers unparalleled scalability," Luna countered loudly, her voice rising above his. She froze mid-step, realizing she'd spoken over him again, and shot him an apologetic glance. Asher didn't miss a beat, continuing his instructions as though she weren't there. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Sharing the space was proving harder than she'd anticipated. Every time she found her rhythm, a stray word from his workshop would seep into her thoughts, breaking her flow. And yet, his group seemed utterly unbothered by her presence, their serene expressions maddeningly unaffected by her interruptions. "Breathe through the noise," Asher said, his words directed at his group, but landing squarely on Luna. She bristled, her jaw tightening as she turned back to her imaginary audience. "And with this investment, we can capture a 20% market share within the first." Her words faltered as someone let out a contented sigh nearby. She turned sharply, her eyes locking on Asher, who raised a single brow in response. "Problem?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with a hint of amusement. "No," she replied curtly, spinning back around. "Just trying to breathe past the chaos." Asher's soft chuckle drifted across the room, and Luna's cheeks burned. This was going to be unbearable. Luna sat at a small, sticky table in the crowded food court, her untouched salad in front of her. She scrolled absently through her notes on her tablet, though her mind kept drifting back to the frustrating morning. Across the bustling space, she spotted Asher weaving through the crowd, a tray balanced effortlessly in his hands. When he approached her table, she raised an eyebrow. "This seat taken?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. She hesitated, then waved a hand dismissively. "Knock yourself out." Asher slid into the seat, setting down his tray, some kind of quinoa bowl and herbal tea, Luna noted with faint amusement. "Of course." He took a slow sip of his tea, seemingly unbothered by her silence. "You rehearse like you're going into battle," he said after a moment, his tone light but curious. Luna stiffened, looking up from her tablet. "And you run a workshop like you're auditioning for a sleep app," she shot back, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. She wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion or the lingering scent of lavender coming off him, but it was harder to summon her usual edge. Asher's lips curved into a small smile. "Tiche?" They sat in silence for a beat, the noise of the food court filling the space between them. Luna stabbed her fork into her salad, finally taking a bite, though she barely tasted it. Asher leaned back in his chair, studying her with a calm that made her itch to fidget. "You're pitching something big," he said, more of a statement than a question. "It's a startup," she replied, her tone clipped. "Tech platform, years of work riding on this one presentation." "That's a lot of pressure," she scoffed softly. "Tell me something I don't know." Asher nodded thoughtfully, stirring his quinoa bowl. "You ever take a breath? Just stop for a moment?" "Stopping doesn't get things done," Luna replied, her eyes narrowing. "I don't have the luxury of sitting around and breathing." "It's not about sitting around," he said, meeting her gaze evenly. "It's about making space for clarity. You can't run on fumes forever." Luna opened her mouth to retort, but found herself closing it again. Something in his tone, gentle yet firm, like he actually believed what he was saying, made her pause. Her shoulders softened, just slightly. "We'll see," she muttered, turning back to her tablet. Asher didn't press, returning to his meal with the same quiet ease. But as they sat there, Luna couldn't help but notice that, for the first time all day, her chest didn't feel quite so tight. The food court bustled around them, a chaotic symphony of clattering trays, overlapping conversations, and the occasional hiss of an espresso machine. Despite the noise, Luna found herself leaning slightly forward, Asher's voice cutting through the din with surprising clarity. "So, let me get this straight," she said, eyeing him over the rim of her iced coffee. "You quit a corporate job to teach people how to breathe?" Asher smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "It's a bit more than that. I help people reconnect with themselves, with the present moment. Most of the time, they just need someone to remind them to slow down." Luna snorted. "Slowing down sounds like a great way to get left behind." "And speeding up sounds like a great way to burn out," he countered, his voice calm as always but carrying a weight that made her pause. He stirred his tea absently, watching her with that unnervingly steady gaze that made her feel both seen and exposed. She broke eye contact, shifting in her seat. "I don't have much of a choice. If I don't push hard, this startup doesn't survive. It's all or nothing." "Why is it all or nothing?" Asher asked, genuinely curious. "What happens if it's not perfect?" "Failure," she said simply, as if the word explained everything. "And failure isn't an option." Asher tilted his head, considering her response. "You talk about failure like it's the end of the road." "Isn't it?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. She hated how vulnerable she sounded, but couldn't stop herself. "What's the point of trying if you're just going to fall flat on your face?" "The point," Asher said gently, "is the trying, the growing. I've failed plenty, more times than I can count, but every failure taught me something I wouldn't have learned otherwise. It's not the end. It's part of the process." Luna studied him, the calm certainty in his expression. It wasn't the first time he'd made her feel like the ground beneath her feet wasn't as solid as she thought. And yet, for some reason, it didn't feel as terrifying as it should have. "Maybe," she murmured, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "But some of us don't have the luxury of taking those chances." Asher smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe you have more of it than you think." Luna didn't reply, but his words lingered as the minutes stretched between them. For the first time in a long time, she let the silence settle, and found it wasn't as uncomfortable as she'd expected. The food court had emptied out a bit, the late afternoon lull settling like a soft haze over the tables. Luna and Asher sat across from each other, their plates pushed to the side, the conversation lingering in the comfortable space that followed their earlier banter. "You mentioned your startup's been years in the making," Asher said, his voice low but inviting. "Why this? Why now?" Luna hesitated, tracing the rim of her water bottle with her finger. "It's complicated," she began, her tone guarded. "I started this because I saw a gap, something people needed, something I needed, at one point, and I knew I could build it. But now," she trailed off, her eyes dropping to the table. "Now it feels like this constant uphill battle, every investor meeting, every pitch. It's like I'm proving I deserve to be in the room, like I'm always one misstep away from losing it all." Asher nodded, his gaze steady. "That sounds exhausting." "It is." She gave a short laugh, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "But what choice do I have? If I don't push, if I don't fight for this, then what does that say about me?" He considered her words in silence for a moment before speaking. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said, his voice quieter now. "Myself." Luna raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You?" Asher leaned back in his chair, his arms loosely crossed. "I used to live by the same rules. Push harder, do more, keep moving. I worked in finance back then. Long hours, high stakes, always chasing the next thing. I thought the grind defined me, that if I stopped, I'd fall apart." "What happened?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He let out a slow breath, his eyes distant for a moment. "I burned out. Hard. I lost someone I cared about because I was too caught up in my own noise to see what really mattered. After that, I couldn't know I wouldn't go back. That's why I do what I do now. It's my way of staying grounded and helping others do the same." Luna studied him, her usual sharpness softened by something closer to empathy. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That sounds hard." It was, he admitted, but it taught me that sometimes the thing you're chasing isn't what you really need. They fell into a thoughtful silence, their differences momentarily eclipsed by the unspoken understanding that passed between them. For the first time, Luna didn't feel the need to fill it. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of meditative music playing softly in the background. Luna sat stiffly on the edge of a yoga mat, her arms crossed over her chest as she eyed the small group scattered around her. She was skeptical, to say the least, but after yet another argument about disrupting each other's focus, Asher had suggested she join in for the final minutes of the workshop. Begrudgingly, she'd agreed, though she wasn't entirely sure why. "Just follow my lead," Asher said from the front of the room, his calm voice somehow cutting through the tension still buzzing in her spine. He stood barefoot, his hands resting lightly at his sides as his dark eyes met hers. "Sit comfortably. Relax your shoulders. Breathe." Luna sighed and adjusted her posture, her movements stiff and mechanical. Relaxing wasn't exactly her strong suit. She could feel the weight of Asher's attention, though he remained composed, his voice soothing as he guided the group through the exercise. "Close your eyes," he instructed. "I'd rather not," Luna muttered, earning herself a faint smile from him. "Suit yourself," he replied gently, stepping closer. "But try to focus on your breath. Feel it move through your body, steady and deep." She gave a half-hearted attempt, inhaling sharply and exhaling just as quickly. Asher raised an eyebrow, crouching down beside her. "The point isn't to hyperventilate," he murmured, a flicker of amusement in his tone. Luna shot him a glare, but before she could retort, he leaned in slightly, his hand brushing against her waist as he repositioned her. "Here," he said, his voice dropping into that low, steady cadence that always seemed to ground the room. "Breathe into this spot. Feel the tension release." The contact was brief, barely a second, but it might as well have been a lightning strike. Her breath hitched, and she stilled, suddenly hyper-aware of the press of his fingers against the fabric of her blouse. His touch was careful, unassuming, yet it sent a spark rippling through her, leaving her skin tingling in its wake. Asher seemed to notice the shift, his eyes lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. The air between them thickened, the soft hum of the music fading into the background as both of them froze. For once, Luna couldn't summon a quip or a glare. Her chest tightened, not unpleasantly, as the edges of Asher's mouth curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Better," he said softly, as if nothing had happened. But as he stood and continued his instructions, Luna knew something had. The room was quiet now. The last of Asher's workshop participants had rolled up their mats and left, their serene goodbyes still hanging faintly in the air. Luna lingered near the window, her tablet forgotten on a chair. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the glass, painting the studio in warm, dappled light. She watched dust motes drift lazily in the stillness, her mind unusually calm. For once, she didn't feel the weight of her to-do list clawing at her. "You stayed," Asher remarked, his voice breaking the silence but not disturbing it. He stood across the room, a towel draped over his shoulder as he picked up a stray mat. Luna glanced at him but didn't move. "I thought about leaving," she admitted, her tone lighter than usual. "But, I don't know. Guess I was curious." Asher chuckled under his breath, walking toward her. "Curious about what?" She shrugged, crossing her arms loosely over her chest. "Why people show up for this? Why they'd sit around and breathe instead of doing something more productive." He leaned against the wall next to her, arms loosely crossed now, mirroring her posture. "And? Any insights?" Luna hesitated, then nodded slightly. "It's not as pointless as I thought, I'll give you that." She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, catching the faint smirk that tugged at his lips. "Don't look so smug. I'm not saying I'm a convert." "Of course not," he replied, a playful glint in his eye. "But you did sit through the entire session. Almost looked like you were trying to relax." She huffed a laugh, shaking her head. "Don't push your luck." They stood in silence for a moment, the quiet between them no longer awkward but oddly comfortable. Asher tilted his head, studying her, not in the infuriatingly calm way that usually made her bristle, but in a way that felt curious, respectful. "You know," he said softly, "your drive makes sense to me now." She blinked, caught off guard. Does it? He nodded, his gaze steady. You care, deeply, about your work, your vision, that kind of passion. It's rare. He paused, but so is knowing when to let go. Luna swallowed, his words hitting closer than she expected. And you think you've got that figured out? No, he admitted, his smile softening. But I'm figuring it out. Maybe you are too. Her lips curved almost involuntarily into the faintest smile. For the first time, she found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, there was more to his perspective than she'd let herself believe. The email subject line read, "Regarding the estate of Eleanor Ridley." Luna barely glanced at it as she scrolled through her inbox in the middle of her fourth coffee of the day. She was sitting at her desk in the corner of her tiny apartment, her tablet propped up with the latest version of her pitch glowing on the screen. The words blurred as her eyes flickered back to the email. Something about it gnawed at her, an itch she couldn't quite place. Sighing, she clicked it. The words unfolded slowly in her mind. Deceased relative, previously unknown property, seaside cottage. Her coffee hovered midway to her lips, forgotten. The email detailed a distant great-aunt she'd never met, a woman her mother had mentioned only a handful of times in passing. Eleanor Ridley, a recluse who'd spent most of her life tucked away in some small coastal town. And now, out of nowhere, this woman had left her a house? Luna blinked, scrolling back to the beginning to make sure she wasn't misreading it. Nope. Somewhere out there, a place she'd need to Google, she owned a cottage. She owned a house! Her laughter bubbled up before she could stop it, strange and sharp in her quiet apartment. Right. Because I have so much time to deal with whatever this is, she muttered aloud, setting the coffee cup down with a thud. Her to-do list stretched longer than her days, and the idea of dropping everything to investigate some random inheritance felt ludicrous. And yet, her eyes drifted back to her tablet and the pitch she'd spent months perfecting. She'd been rehearsing tirelessly, chasing investors like her entire existence depended on it. She thought it did, really. But now, a strange question hovered at the edge of her mind. What's out there? She opened her laptop, pulling up a map of the coastline mentioned in the email. A quick search yielded pictures of rocky cliffs, wildflowers, and a cottage perched on the edge of it all, its weathered shutters bleached by the sun. The sight of it snagged something deep in her chest, a twinge she couldn't quite name. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of the moment. It was a reminder about her next meeting. Luna shut the laptop hurriedly, but the image of the cottage lingered, as insistent as the pull of a tide. The city buzzed faintly outside the cafe window, but inside it was quieter, the low hum of conversation and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine filling the space. Asher sat across from Luna, his herbal tea untouched, his head tilted slightly as he listened. Luna's fingers traced the edge of her coffee cup, her words careful but steady. So, she began, her eyes flickering to meet his, I inherited this cottage, by the sea, from a relative I never even knew existed. Asher nodded, his expression open, waiting. He was always like this, never rushing her, his calm making her feel both at ease and slightly unraveled. She breathed in sharply, trying to keep her nerves in check. I'm thinking of going there, she continued. It's a little out of the way, but I feel like I need to see it. Maybe spend a few days. That makes sense, Asher said simply, his voice soothing without trying to be. It sounds like the kind of place that could give you some space to think. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. Yeah, that's kind of the point. There was a pause, and then almost impulsively, she added, I thought maybe you'd want to come. Asher blinked, clearly caught off guard. Me? Yes, you, Luna said quickly, suddenly feeling self-conscious. I thought it might be good for both of us, to get away for a bit, clear our heads. He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes searching hers, and she resisted the urge to squirm under his steady gaze. You want me to help you figure out what to do with it? He asked, his tone gentle. No, she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I don't know. Maybe, I just think. I could use your perspective, and She broke off, inhaling deeply. I think you could use it too. The quiet, I mean. A smile tugged at the corners of his lips, soft but genuine. I didn't realize you'd been paying attention. Luna rolled her eyes, though her cheeks flushed faintly. "Don't let it go to your head." His smile widened, and he nodded. "Okay, let's go." It was so simple, so sure that it caught her off guard. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful, like maybe she wasn't doing this alone. The waves lapped gently at the shore, a soft rhythm that seemed to echo the unspoken connection growing between them. The air smelled of salt and something wild, the kind of clean that only existed far from the city. Luna walked barefoot along the beach, her heels dangling from one hand, the cool sand pressing between her toes. Beside her, Asher matched her pace, his hands tucked into his pockets, his quiet presence grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. The sun had dipped below the horizon not long ago, leaving streaks of orange and pink to fade into deep blue. Above them, the first stars were beginning to show, pinpricks of light scattered across the darkening sky. The cottage loomed behind them in the distance, its weathered silhouette blending into the rocky cliffs. "You grew up near the water?" Asher asked, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, as though louder words might shatter the tranquility around them. Luna nodded, her gaze fixed on the surf. "I did. My parents had a tiny place by the lake. Nothing like this, though." She gestured to the sprawling ocean that stretched endlessly before them. "This feels bigger, wilder, like it doesn't care if you're here or not." Asher smiled faintly. "That's the beauty of it, I think. It just is. No expectations." He glanced at her, his dark eyes catching the faint moonlight. "You miss it? Living by the water?" She hesitated, dragging her toe through the sand. "Sometimes. But I've always been moving forward, you know. New places, new goals. I guess I never thought about looking back." They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle hiss of the waves and the occasional cry of a seabird. Finally, they reached a flat, grassy patch near the dunes and sat down. Asher leaned back on his palms, tilting his face to the sky. Luna hugged her knees to her chest, the breeze tugging at her hair. "I used to stare at the stars when I was a kid," Asher murmured. "Made me feel small, but not in a bad way, like I didn't have to carry everything alone." Luna turned to him, her chest tightening. "And now?" He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his gaze softened. "Now, I think sharing the weight might not be so bad." The words lingered between them, heavy and light all at once, as the tide whispered its endless secrets to the shore. The waves rolled in and out, their rhythm steady and unchanging, as if the ocean itself were breathing. Luna stood at the water's edge, the cool tide soaking the hem of her jeans and chilling her ankles. Asher was a few steps behind her, the wind catching his loose shirt and ruffling his hair. She stared out at the horizon, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I'm scared," Luna said finally, her voice barely louder than the surf. She didn't turn around to face him, but she felt his attention shift toward her like a warm weight. "Of what?" Asher asked gently, his footsteps soft in the sand as he moved closer. "Of failing," she admitted, her throat tightening. The words came out harsher than she intended, like they'd been waiting to escape. "Of putting everything I have into this startup and still coming up short. Of proving to everyone, and to myself, that I'm not enough." Asher stepped beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence, but not so near that he crowded her. "You've come this far," he said after a moment. "Don't you think that says something?" She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "It's not enough to get close. If I don't succeed, what was all of this for? The sacrifices, the sleepless nights. I don't know who I am if I'm not chasing this dream." He let the silence stretch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I used to feel that way," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I thought I had to keep chasing success, purpose, love. But when it all fell apart, I realized I wasn't chasing for the right reasons. I was running from loss, from grief, from myself." Luna turned to look at him. His expression was calm, but there was a shadow in his eyes, a weight he wasn't trying to hide. "That's why you left your old life?" she asked. He nodded. "It didn't fix everything. I'm still figuring it out, but slowing down, letting myself feel it, it helped." For a moment, the vulnerability between them, raw and unguarded, hung in the salty air. Luna's voice softened. "What if I don't know how to stop running?" "Then maybe," Asher said, his gaze steady and warm. You let yourself take just one step and then another. She let the words sink in, the waves brushing against her feet like an unspoken promise. Maybe, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ocean. But as she glanced toward him, a small, tentative smile formed. The night wrapped around them like a soft, heavy blanket, the stars scattered across the velvet sky above. The beach was quiet now, the gentle crash of the waves the only sound as Luna and Asher sat side by side in the cool sand. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed, and the moon cast a silver glow over the shoreline, illuminating their faces in soft light. Luna hugged her knees to her chest, her toes buried in the cool sand. She watched the tide ebb and flow, its rhythm steady, unyielding. It's strange, she murmured, her voice low as if she were speaking to the ocean itself. Sitting here, it feels like everything else, the deadlines, the meetings, the pressure, doesn't exist. Asher glanced at her, his profile serene in the moonlight. Maybe it doesn't, he said simply, his voice as steady as the waves. At least not in this moment. She turned her head to meet his gaze, searching his eyes for something she couldn't name. Do you ever stop worrying about what's next or what could go wrong? He smiled faintly, his dark eyes warm. Not completely, he admitted. But I've learned that life isn't about erasing the doubts. It's about choosing to keep going, even with them, and trusting that, somehow, I'll figure it out. Luna's throat tightened. The weight of his words settled over her, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She looked back at the water, drawing slow, measured breaths. I don't know if I can do that, she said softly. Let go. Trust. Asher shifted closer, his arm brushing hers, and the gentle, unspoken connection sent warmth flooding through her. You don't have to do it all at once, he said. Sometimes it's just about deciding to try. She was quiet for a long moment, the sound of her heartbeat mixing with the rhythm of the waves. Then, slowly, she turned to him. What if I fall? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Asher smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting with quiet certainty. Then I'll be there to catch you. Her chest tightened, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else, something lighter, deeper. She exhaled and let herself smile back, tentative but real. Okay, she said softly. Let's try. They sat there together, facing the endless horizon, the promise of something new unfolding between them. The beach was quiet in the early morning light, the soft pinks and golds of dawn spilling across the sky. The tide rolled in slowly, its rhythm steady and soothing. Luna and Asher sat side by side on an old weathered log, their shoulders almost touching but not quite. The world seemed suspended in this moment, the chaos of their lives left somewhere far away. Luna ran her fingers through the sand absently, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I never thought I'd end up here, she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of wonder. Not just the beach, but this, feeling like I don't have to fight so hard all the time. Asher glanced at her, his dark eyes warm with quiet understanding. It's not easy to let go of that fight, he said, his voice low and steady. You've carried it for so long, it's part of what brought you here. She nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You're right. It's just different now. I used to think slowing down meant giving up. But now, she paused, searching for the words. Now I think maybe it's about making space for something else, something better. Asher leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze drifting to the waves. You've changed, he said after a moment. When we first met, it was like you were always running, like you couldn't stop, even if you wanted to. Luna laughed softly, the sound light. And you were so calm, it drove me crazy, like nothing ever fazed you. He chuckled, shaking his head. Trust me, plenty fazes me. I just learned how to sit with it instead of letting it run my life. She studied him for a moment, her expression softening. I've learned a lot from you, you know. His brow lifted slightly, and he turned to her with a small smile. Funny, I was going to say the same about you. They fell into a comfortable silence, their breaths syncing with the rhythm of the waves. Luna leaned into him ever so slightly, and he didn't hesitate to let his shoulder press into hers. For the first time in a long while, both felt whole, not despite their differences, but because of them. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting the sky in hues of amber and rose. The waves mirrored the colors, the water shimmering with every ripple as it stretched endlessly before them. Luna and Asher sat side by side on the warm sand, their legs stretched out, toes buried in the grains. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds, the gentle crash of waves and the faint rustle of the breeze through the grasses on the dunes. For a while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't an uneasy silence, but the kind that felt like the natural rhythm of things, like the pause between heartbeats. Luna tilted her head back slightly, her face catching the last of the sunlight, her dark hair wild in the wind. She could feel the warmth of Asher beside her, close but not crowding, his quiet presence grounding her the way it always did. She broke the silence first, her voice soft. I always thought moments like this were just stories, something people made up to make life seem more poetic than it really is. She glanced at him, a wry smile tugging at her lips. Turns out I was wrong. Asher chuckled, the sound low and easy, and turned to face her. His dark eyes reflected the fading light, calm yet filled with something deeper, something certain. It's not that moments like this don't exist, he said. It's just that sometimes we move too fast to notice them. Luna gave a small, thoughtful nod, her gaze drifting back to the horizon. Maybe that's what this all was about, she murmured, her words more to herself than him, slowing down, seeing what's right in front of me. Asher leaned back on his hands, his posture relaxed. And what do you see now? She hesitated, the weight of the question settling over her. Then, slowly, she turned to him, her voice steady but filled with quiet vulnerability. I see possibility. I see something I didn't think I'd ever find. A pause, her gaze meeting his. Peace. He smiled, something soft and unspoken passing between them. The sun dipped lower, the first stars just beginning to flicker into view. As the tide pulled in and out, steady and sure, they sat there, their shoulders brushing, open to whatever lay ahead. The cottage was quiet, wrapped in the soft stillness of early evening. Inside, the fire crackled low in the hearth, the golden light flickering over the walls and casting long shadows that danced with the rhythm of the flames. Luna sat curled on the worn sofa, her legs tucked beneath her, a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands. The salty breeze drifted through the open window, carrying with it the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Asher sat across from her on the floor, his back resting against the armchair, his own mug balanced on the edge of the coffee table. He was quiet, his dark eyes thoughtful as they followed the shifting embers in the fire. The silence between them was comfortable, a new kind of language they'd grown fluent in over the past days. Luna tilted her head, studying him. It's strange, she murmured finally, her voice soft but clear. When I first met you, I thought you were everything I didn't have time for. Calm, slow, reflective. I thought stopping meant losing. Asher lifted his eyes to hers, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. And now? She smiled faintly, leaning back against the cushions. Now, I think stopping might have been the only way forward. He nodded, his expression warm and steady. Funny, I thought someone like you, driven, relentless, would burn right past me. I didn't think I'd have anything to offer you. You did, she said simply, more than I knew I needed. They sat in silence again, the weight of their words settling over them like the tide. Luna glanced toward the window, where the ocean stretched into the endless horizon. You know, I used to think purpose was something you had to fight for, build, prove, but maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just being here, fully here. Asher's gaze softened. And love? Her chest tightened, but it wasn't fear this time. She met his eyes, the firelight dancing between them. Love, she said quietly, is the courage to be here with someone else. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. Then we've found it. She nodded, the small smile growing. Yeah, I think we have. And as the fire crackled on, the waves whispering just beyond, they sat together, their journey not ending, but beginning.